An IFR flight plan is the ticket of admission to the ATC system. The words flight plan have different meanings for pilots and controllers. What we pilots call the flight plan is what controllers think of as a proposal that becomes a flight plan when it's activated. To avoid confusion, we'll use flight plan to mean what the pilot requested.
When the system is busy, the flight plan can be filed by DUOT or recorded on FastFile at the flight service station. When using FastFile, it's a good idea to end the recording with a phone number where you can be reached in case there are questions that need to be resolved. If the recorded flight plan has a wrong fix, airway number, or misspelled identifier, the computer will reject the flight plan. If you can't be reached, the specialist has to guess the route and lists a code on the flight plan which tells the controller to verify the route by reading the full route in the clearance. If the system isn't busy, it's preferable to file in person or phone to the nearest FSS. You'll be talking to a flight service specialist who copies the flight plan directly. If there are any questions or discrepancies, they can be resolved at that time. The specialist could also determine where to reach you for the next few minutes in case there are further questions. Filing by radio should only be done if it can't be done in person or by telephone. According to the Airman's Information Manual, flight plans can also be filed with a control tower. However, traffic saturation frequently prevents tower controllers from accepting flight plans by radio, and you'll probably be asked to file with the nearest FSS. Whenever possible, avoid filing while airborne. Filling in all the blanks on the flight plan takes a lot of airtime and keeps others from using the frequency. Another disadvantage is that it takes some time to put the flight plan in the computer. The specialist working the in-flight position may have to look up identifiers before typing the proposal into the computer. Then, because of preset priorities, the computer may not process the proposal for several minutes. All of this means you may wait 10 or more minutes before ATC can issue a clearance. You may wonder, why not file directly with a TRACON or center controller? Well, let's look at what has to be done to get the flight plan entered and obtain a clearance. The controller has to do all the things the flight service specialist must do. Look up the identifiers, type the information in, and wait for the computer to process the proposal. While waiting for the clearance, the controller can't issue a clearance to enter another controller's airspace without coordinating with that controller. Allowing an aircraft to enter another controller's airspace without coordination is an operational deviation. If the pilot can't remain VFR, the controller will have to issue a clearance and a possible hold to keep the aircraft in his airspace while waiting for the clearance. Considering all the controller has to do to accept your air-filed flight plan, together with a normal workload, don't be surprised if you're asked to file with flight service. There are situations when air filing with a TRACON or center does work. The most obvious one is if the entire flight is in the controller's airspace. Chances of success also improve when the airspace isn't busy. If the controller agrees to accept the flight plan, there are things you can do to make the job easier. Don't wait until it's urgent that you get an IFR clearance. The controller might not be able to deal with you at the moment, but can do so after a couple of minutes. Speak slowly. The controller is trying to write all this down. Instead of names of nav aids, use the 3-letter identifiers. The controller probably doesn't know the identifiers for nav aids that are some distance from his airspace. Describe the route as Victor 169 LZZ, not Victor 169 Lampasas. The easier you can make it for the controller, the less likely that he or she will regret taking the flight plan. The information required on an IFR flight plan is spelled out in regulations. The flight plan blank has space for 16 items, not all of which are needed by the controller. The controller needs the aircraft identification, type, special equipment suffix, true airspeed, altitude requested, departure point, and the complete route, including destination. The rule that lists the items required for an IFR flight plan states that all information must be filed unless otherwise authorized by ATC. If the controller agrees to do so, the flight plan can be limited to the items needed, which eliminates a lot of the game of 20 questions. If you want to file a flight plan and reserve the right to choose your en route altitude, you can request VFR on top in lieu of an assigned altitude. Some explanation is called for. In regulatory and procedural terms, VFR on top is an operation under instrument flight rules with the en route portion in VFR conditions. If you are flying visual flight rules above the clouds, making a first contact with ATC, it helps to end the call with the letters VFR. But don't say you are VFR on top. You might cause an increase in the controller's respiration rate, pulse rate, and stomach acidity. If you say VFR on top, the controller will probably think you are under instrument flight rules and haven't been properly handed off.
If weather conditions are such that you can reasonably expect to reach VFR conditions above the clouds, you can request an IFR clearance to VFR conditions.
Most of the time, this can be done without filling in all the flight plan blanks. It works well because you are staying in one controller's airspace. The clearance to climb to VFR conditions will have a clearance limit and maximum altitude to keep you in the controller's airspace. The usual clearance is to reverse course and advise if not VFR at a specified fix, and maintain a specific altitude and advise if not VFR at that altitude. As you've guessed, the named fix and altitude represent the limits of the controller's airspace. If tops have been reported by another aircraft, the controller is supposed to advise the altitude of the tops. If there are no reports, the controller must tell you that there are no tops reports. If the weather in Class C or D airspace is below VFR requirements, special VFR can be used to enter, depart, or operate in that airspace. The aircraft must stay clear of clouds, and for airplanes, the surface visibility must be at least 1 mile to take off or land.
Special VFR must be requested by the pilot. A flight plan is not required, but the pilot must give ATC a detailed request in order to fit the operation into the flow of traffic.
For example, taking off and leaving Class C or D airspace, the pilot must request a specific direction to fly out of that airspace. The special VFR clearance does not assign an altitude because the pilot must stay clear of clouds. An altitude to fly at or below may be specified to assure separation. However, the specified altitude must allow operation at or above the minimum safe altitude.
ATC will maintain separation between special VFR flights as well as separation between special VFR flights and IFR aircraft. Separation is only furnished while the special VFR aircraft is in Class C or D airspace.
Now the limitations. Special VFR at night requires the pilot to be instrument rated and the aircraft instrument equipped. There are some 30-odd airports where fixed-wing special VFR is prohibited. They are designated on both VFR and IFR charts. Finally, fixed-wing special VFR is approved only if it will not delay arriving or departing IFR flights. When the important parts of the flight plan you filed reach the center host computer, it checks for preferential departure routes. Some centers even have controllers manually checking for these routes. One of the secrets to getting cleared as filed is to request fixes and routes which are used for departures. If you ask for a route or fix that's used for arrivals, you will probably get a clearance different from your request. Filing for preferred routes or part of a preferred route appropriate to departure or arrival increases the chances for hearing the words "cleared as filed." The AIM states that IFR clearances are issued on the basis of preferred routes. Practically, the computer also checks and will change the flight plan to conform with the preferred route. Flight plans should be filed at least 30 minutes prior to the proposed departure. They will accept your flight plan for an immediate departure, but it could take up to 30 minutes to process the flight plan data. Normally, the clearance reaches the person who relays it 15 minutes before departure time. This is what ATC calls the proposal strip. If the computer disagreed with the route you filed, the proposal strip will be coded with the letters FRC, which means the controller must read the full route.
The proposal strip also goes to the ATC facility that will control the departure. If the flight will enter another facility's airspace shortly after departure, a proposal strip will also go to that facility. These times vary, and they're established between facilities by letter of agreement.
Flight strips will be made at the facilities overflown and the arrival facility when the flight plan is activated. At tower airports, you can call for the clearance before engine start. Call clearance delivery if there is one. If not, call ground control. This is a good practice if there's a possibility of delays. It saves the frustration of either shutting down or waiting for the clearance with the engine or engines running. How to get an IFR clearance at a non-tower airport depends on what's available. At some locations, you can communicate with ATC or FSS on the ground. At other airports, you may have to get the clearance over the telephone. If you aren't sure, ask flight service when you file the flight plan. You can be certain, though, that the clearance will have a clearance void time.
Clearance void time is used by ATC to advise you that the departure clearance is automatically canceled if you do not take off by the specified time.
If you do not take off, you must notify ATC as soon as possible, but not more than 30 minutes after the void time. The clearance may even specify less than 30 minutes after void time to inform ATC of your intentions. Failure to notify ATC will result in the aircraft being considered overdue, and search and rescue will be initiated. The clearance may also have a release time. Release time is the earliest time you may take off.
Because you might not have very many minutes until void time, it's a good idea to be as ready as possible for takeoff. This means all the items down to, but not including engine start, should be completed.
After this insider's view, Dick Collins will show you how those on the ground handle the en route portion of the flight. But first, Najib Halaby discusses how technological growth can make the system safer and more flexible.
You know, if you are an air traffic controller, I'm a member of the Air Traffic Control Association, so I'm very aware of their thinking and their feeling. They feel responsible for separating aircraft. Pilots feel responsible for separating aircraft. And so there is a bit of tension between those two controllers, the pilot and the ground controller. They have very limited capabilities, particularly for last clear chance separation of aircraft. But yet they are in charge of the architecture. So they think of inverted pyramids. And they think of one controller controlling this area, another controller this area, a radar over here doing that, the VOR here, etc. So they think of it in rigid architecture. We're now entering into a period where we can think of architecture that is much more flexible, is much more system performance. And that's because we can have TCAS, we can even have TCAS in general aviation aircraft, business aviation aircraft, and GPS, and data link, and finally heads-up display. There is no reason why we can't have projected right on the windshield the true situation electronically. Louis DeFlores conceived of this 40 years ago. I did some work with him when I was a test pilot in Patuxent. And we had in mind giving the pilot the capability of seeing the situation even though he's in the clouds. Now there's no reason we can't do that electronically. Expensive, but if we really put our minds to it, we can give the pilot everything he needs to avoid collisions. That's much better than what a ground controller can do with the radars and the communication system.
Riding along an en route flight, the proceedings are usually low-key and relaxed, but the interface with air traffic control is still there, and it helps to understand this relationship.
When we file an IFR flight plan, some of the information goes to the air traffic controllers, and some of the information is for search and rescue, should we not arrive at an airport along the way. When we file a VFR flight plan, air traffic controllers don't get any information. It's all for search and rescue. What the en route controllers who handle the flight need to know is fairly logical, too. Just looking at the flight plan form will tell you what the controller needs and what the Civil Air Patrol needs. Starting at the end of the form, the air traffic controller hardly needs to know the color of your airplane in order to provide traffic separation. Nor does the controller need to know how many people are on board, or the pilot's name, or the alternate airport, or even the amount of fuel on board. He won't even lend you his credit card to fill up. Even the estimated time en route is not an essential bit of information for the en route air traffic control system. It does need to know who you are, so it'll know what to call you. It needs to know what sort of airplane you're flying and how it's equipped. It needs to know your true airspeed. It needs to know where you're leaving from so the system will know where to send your clearance. It needs to know when you want to leave so it'll know what time to have your clearance ready. It needs to know what altitude you want to fly, and it needs to know the route that you propose to fly and the destination. When you give the system this information through filing a flight plan, it then passes it along to all the air traffic controllers who will be involved in handling your flight. They will then be guided by your wishes as long as they aren't at right angles to the normal procedures of the air traffic control system. At times we have all filed flight plans that bring gales of laughter from ATC or from the ATC computers. One way to learn a little about this is filing your own flight plans on a DUOT system. It will not accept a flight plan that does not fit into the departure, en route, or arrival system. But it will accept a flight plan that a controller won't read to you. For example, if you're flying from a Baltimore satellite to Claremont Airport in Ohio to buy a new headset from Sporty's, the only en route clearance they might read will be one that follows the airways. But once you're en route and in contact with Washington Center after first talking to Baltimore and Dulles departure controls, and once you get to the Kessel VOR, the controller will almost always clear you direct to York, Victor 128 to the Calif intersection, direct to India 69. Always remember that the controllers have the information on the clearance that was read to you. They know where you've been cleared to go. They know the altitude you've been cleared to fly. Keeping up with things like the ETA and the fuel and the alternate airport is up to you. If your flight is VFR and you file a VFR flight plan, it really serves no purpose unless you fail to close the flight plan. In that event, they will first make a search by phone to see if you just missed the sign above the urinal asking if you've closed your flight plan. If they can't locate the airplane on an airport in a simple search like that, the militia will be called out. The simple message is that if you file a VFR flight plan, don't forget to close it. It's also a good idea to check in with facilities along the way so there will be some record of your progress if you do not arrive. Altitudes are a big deal to air traffic control. A lot of things are based on altitudes. A key altitude that isn't in any rule book is flight level 230. Almost everywhere, this is the dividing line between high and low altitude sectors at air route traffic control centers. Aircraft flying at flight level 230 and below are low. Aircraft at flight level 240 and above are handled by high-altitude sector controllers. The high-altitude sectors are generally larger than the low. If you fly a relatively slow turbocharged piston or turboprop airplane that is capable of cruising above flight level 230, you might not find the warmest of welcomes up there in busy areas. Putting a 250-knot airplane on busy routes and at altitudes where most airplanes are cruising 450 is more than you can expect a controller to do. Usually when you hear horror stories on routing from pilots flying turboprop airplanes, they come from busy areas and after a request to fly well above flight level 230. Whether we fly IFR high or low, we get frequency changes and new controllers along the way. Depending on the length and location of the flight, we might talk with controllers at 2 or more centers, as well as controllers in terminal facilities. When control is passed from one sector to another, the airplane is said to be handed off. That really sounds like a manual operation, but it's computerized. Occasionally, a controller might tell us that the next controller is not taking the handoff. That means that the current controller can't let you fly into the next one's airspace.
He might issue holding instructions or, as is frequently done, just tell you to do a 360. Handoffs are usually accomplished well before you reach the next controller's airspace, just to give time.
This explains why, if you make a request for a lower altitude, for example, immediately after being handed off, the controller will likely say something like, lower in 5 miles. It'll be 5 miles before you actually reach his airspace. Why might a controller not take a handoff? It could be that he already has all the airplanes that he can handle. Weather could be a factor. There could be an emergency in his sector or at the airport. If you're VFR getting traffic advisories, the next controller might simply not have the time to offer this optional service. Just always know that it's nothing personal. Look at it this way. They have to keep on controlling until they get the airplanes down, and controllers are just as eager as pilots to get those airplanes safely landed. Holding is seldom related to en route traffic. It is almost always related to airport or terminal area acceptance rates. So if you do get a hold while en route, it is probably related to some airport problem down the line. When the weather gets bad, or the wind blows, or the snow flies, airport capacity is less. And while flow control, holding airplanes on the ground, has resulted in less holding than in the good old days, it still happens. The size of sectors varies, and on some trips you might clip the edge of a few, giving rather rapid frequency changes. In some areas, usually out in the wide open spaces, a sector might use the same frequency through 2 different remote communications outlets, so you may hear some transmissions clearly while others are hard to understand. If ever you think you've been forgotten or are flying out of range, call and ask. If you get an incorrect frequency, the controller will either give you the correct one or send you back to the previous frequency. If all else fails, you can look up a frequency in your vicinity and call on this. It might not be the frequency for the sector you're in, but the controller can set you straight. When we fly by major or even relatively minor terminal areas at lower altitudes, we have to recognize the necessity of fitting in with the flow of high-performance airplanes to and from the major airport. There are no absolutes on this, but jets are usually 10,000 or 11,000 feet when 30 miles out. If VFR, you can plan to avoid such airports by that distance, and you'll be beneath at least most of the traffic. If you're IFR, you can anticipate vectoring or rerouting or perhaps a higher altitude than you would like if you file through a major terminal area. Wherever, when in visual conditions, keep up that visual vigil for other traffic. St. Louis is always a good example. If east or westbound, you're free to file the airways that bust through the area. But if it's a busy time, you might get a lot of vectors or a higher altitude than you would like, especially if westbound in the windy season. If flying from afar, a plan that uses Victor 234 to the south or Victor 50 to the north might work better. When the highways become congested, they're forever telling us to take alternate routes. This works in airplanes too. One thing that works like a charm is the tower en route system. It should really be called the approach control en route system because that's who you talk with except for takeoff and landing. While these are available in the boondocks as well as in busy areas, it is in busy airspace that they're the most common and will do you the most good. The New York area has page after page of these, and if you want to go to any of the listed places, this is the easy way to go at low altitude on relatively short trips. A few low altitude routes are even for jets only, some for props only, and some for single engine only, with no singles allowed on others. Before you ask why no singles, we'll show you. In a burst of compassion, by letting singles turn at Dixie instead of at Ziggy, some overwater flying is eliminated. When you do file using the tower en route system, be sure to abide by the maximum altitudes. In some cases, you will find that the maximum altitude listed might be the only altitude available. Be familiar with the available routes in areas where you fly and use them when possible. This doesn't guarantee there will be no departure, en route, or arrival delay. The same constraints apply as with any flight. They are, however, usually the best deal possible. When you file to use the tower en route system, be sure to put the notation TEC in the remarks section of the flight plan. Other than this, the operation is just like any other IFR flight. Weather along any route, and especially in a high traffic area, can greatly complicate the controller's job. Flow control is used to address this, but at times the weather is worse than forecast, or the path of a snowstorm will not follow predictions. The controllers you talk to try to keep up with the weather, but you do have to always remember that a controller's sector is pretty much his world. His job is to keep airplanes in that sector separated. Unless word comes from flow control, a controller in Indianapolis is unlikely to know that an unforecast snowstorm is about to close all the New York airports. The controller does have access to some weather information, and when he has time, will be glad to get that information for you. However, in busy times, it is better to use the flight service station for weather information.
Showing no activity across Indiana, Ohio, Illinois.
Landing and departing runway 3.
Many pilots follow the good practice of listening to ATIS broadcasts as they fly along to keep tab on the weather ahead, to the sides, and behind. If you're headed to a relatively major airport that is below or wavering around minimums, your controller might make you aware of this when you're still some distance away and ask your intentions. If you're headed for a satellite airport with no weather reporting, the controller may not know of a below minimum condition. In a quickly developing, unforecast adverse condition, the controller probably gets the best information from pilots. So if the weather is bad where it was supposed to be good, be sure and tell the controller of the condition. Most pilots think of deviations in terms of thunderstorms and building cumulus clouds, and these are the most frequent reasons for deviating from the route along which you're cleared. No controller wants to make you fly through turbulent clouds, and the pilot can help by asking for deviations as far ahead of time as possible. If a pilot bursts out on the frequency and says he has to turn right immediately, this puts the controller in a considerable bind if there's any other traffic around. Try also to be as specific as you can about a deviation. Telling a controller you want to turn right a bit for a while doesn't do as much for him as saying that you want to turn right 30 degrees for about 30 miles. After saying that, if the condition changes, just modify the estimate of the heading and distance involved in the deviation. If a weather deviation won't take you more than a mile or two off the airway and won't involve a heading change of more than 10 degrees, the controller may never notice if you do it on your own. Any more than that, though, and you'll get his attention, especially if you make a big heading change that will look to him like you're heading somewhere else. There are a lot of thunderstorms in the southeast United States, as well as a lot of restricted airspace. The military uses this restricted airspace for high-speed operations, and it's no place for a slow intruder. When asking for deviations, be aware that the controller can't clear you into an area that is in use unless you declare an emergency. This is best handled by using a different route if it appears deviations will be necessary. There are reasons other than weather for deviations from the plan. Because pilots are sometimes, well, bashful or proud or too brave or whatever, a controller will always wonder why the change in plan. It's thus not a bad idea to add a few words to the request, like,
I need to descend and land at Morgantown right now because my wife said she absolutely positively has to go to the bathroom. Then the controller knows the change is not flight related. If it's because of a fuel shortage, you can say that the winds were stronger than forecast. If a deviation from the plan is related to something not quite right with the airplane, be very plain about that. An emergency need not be declared unless there is a necessity for priority, or, said another way, if normal handling would make the emergency worse, to the point that the outcome of the flight would be in doubt. Many an airplane has been lost by the failure of a simple system, and if you will explain a failure to the controller, he will then do everything he can to help you. He sure can't fly the airplane, or fix the engine, or put fuel back in the tanks, but he can help you navigate to the nearest suitable airport and get whatever information might help, such as the weather or airport conditions. The controller will also initiate immediate search and rescue efforts if you reach the ground short of the airport. Be aware that if a controller feels the situation is slipping away from a pilot, the controller may declare that an emergency exists.
Consider him as an emergency. He hasn't declared.
There is a sort of partial emergency related to fuel called a minimum fuel advisory. If any undue delay would cause an emergency, minimum fuel are the words to use. Pilots need to understand the controller's precise role here. He is required to relay the minimum fuel information on to any other facility to whom control is transferred, and all controllers involved are required to be alert for any occurrence that might delay the aircraft. That is all. No priority, no special handling. The controller would advise the pilot of unexpected delay. Then, if the pilot absolutely had to have priority, the use of the emergency word would be necessary.
En route flying, though, is pretty routine. Fly along and get traffic advisories if VFR, or follow the clearance and change frequencies as appropriate if IFR. When it comes time for the arrival, though, the pace quickens, and now Rob will tell you what happens in that phase of flight.
Approaching the destination, the tempo picks up for the pilot, and it also increases for the ATC system and the controllers.
Aircraft congregate in the vicinity of an airport, where the funnel gets smaller. There's much more traffic in a smaller piece of airspace. The system can regulate the flow of departure aircraft by controlling the rate of takeoffs.
523 flight in 180, only 18 left, clear takeoff.
On the other hand, arrivals, which are already airborne, are more difficult to regulate. When flow control works, the number of and arrival times of inbound aircraft matches airport capacity. Sounds simple, doesn't it? Wait, there's more to this than meets the eye. If the airport has a capacity of 90 landings in an hour, aircraft must be regulated to arrive at a rate of 6 every 4 minutes.
If there's a 4-minute period without an arrival, the actual capacity for that hour has been decreased to 84 arrivals.
The perfect flow control system would have aircraft depart so as to arrive at the airport during the moment there is space for its landing. If you combine the human element with weather, you can see why this goal may never be achieved. When you are close to the destination and the en route controller gives you a holding clearance, the message is there is no space for your landing at the time you would arrive. What has happened is the TRACON has told the center that they can only accept aircraft a specified number of miles in trail from each of the surrounding sectors. This has a domino effect. That center then limits the aircraft acceptance rate from the surrounding centers.
I'm getting 20 in trail from the New York Center on their departures, and I'll do the same from Boston. Making that 30 to altitude be no problem. We'll handle that in-house here.
Human nature being human nature, when the TRACON limits the rate to 20 miles in trail, the center will probably limit their acceptance rate to 30 miles in trail. This could go on and on, with each facility putting a bigger cushion on the acceptance rate.
This is where central flow control steps in. By cajoling, wheedling, and negotiation, it keeps the flow through the adjoining facilities reasonably close to the airport acceptance rate. For some airports, national or local flow control may also set estimated departure clearance times, or EDCT programs. When there are too many aircraft inbound to an airport at one time, the computer adjusts departure time for randomly selected flight plans to have the aircraft arrive when there is space for landing. There are only a few airports which routinely use EDC times. However, unusual weather conditions may cause them to be used to regulate the flow to an airport which is normally less busy. A major event, such as the Super Bowl or World Series, which draws a large number of aircraft, may also bring EDC times into use. At the terminal airport, the ideal arrival situation is the four-corner or four-post arrival fixes we've talked about. They are then vectored to a descent area, which is specific for the arrival runway or runways. For example, if approaches are for runway 18 left and right, the descent area is aligned with the runways north of the airport. Descent to initial approach altitude and vectoring to intercept the approach course is accomplished in the descent area. If noise abatement is a consideration, the altitude at the initial approach fix could be several thousand feet or more above glide slope intercept altitude. TRACON airspace has to allow room for descent and maneuvering for the approaches at the principal and satellite airports. The vertical limit of TRACON airspace varies as a function of the amount of air traffic handled. High-traffic TRACONs and TRACONs whose lateral airspace is limited by other airspace considerations might own up to 14,000 feet, while other TRACONs may top out at 6,000 feet. Non-radar approach controls usually own the airspace up to 3,000 feet or so above the surface. Depending on the amount of traffic, control positions may be decombined with a controller for arrivals to a specific runway. Or, if traffic is light, the positions may be combined with one approach controller working all the arrivals. What happens in the arrival phase is largely dictated by weather and traffic volume. If the conditions are low IFR and high traffic flow, there may be delays and approaches to near minimums. In better weather conditions, ATC may be using visual approaches with no delays. Inbound to a satellite airport when air traffic is light, the clearance might just be a cruise clearance.
Depending on the architecture, the approach may be controlled by a TRACON, TRACAB, or by the center sector. At a busy airport, it'll be the TRACON. A less busy airport may have a TRACAB, but this is really splitting hairs.
A TRACAB is an approach and departure control which is located in the cab of the tower. At an airport which is not in the airspace allocated to a TRACON or TRACAB, the approach will be controlled by the center sector. Let's take a look at an arrival at a busy airport where the inbound aircraft gets the full treatment. At least 15 minutes before the aircraft arrives, the TRACON will get an inbound progress strip. This strip has the usual information: the call sign, aircraft type, equipment suffix, computer identification number, and the transponder code. Items which are different from the outbound and overflight strips are the coordination fix and what is called the transfer of control and communications fix. The coordination fix is a point in the last controller's airspace over which the aircraft is to be routed. The transfer of control and communications fix is within the next controller's airspace. This gives the receiving TRACON controller the 2 points along which the aircraft will arrive. The time listed is the estimated time the aircraft will be over a particular point, which is usually the coordination fix. Altitude and route of flight are not listed.
Altitude is usually not listed because the arrival procedure is structured. Aircraft inbound on a particular route will always be assigned the same altitude. Any exceptions to this prearranged altitude will have to be coordinated between the present controller and the receiving controller. This is different than overflights, which have a wide range of altitudes as well as routes. Altitude information is important for coordination of overflights.
To avoid surprises, the approach controller will verify the altitude of all aircraft and also has the Mode C altitude readout. The identifier of the destination airport is listed where the route of flight would be on the departure and overflight strips. After being handed off to the approach controller, the aircraft is usually kept at a relatively high altitude until it is in the descent area. If departures are being cleared to maintain 6,000 feet and to expect 2,000 10 minutes after departure, you can bet arrivals will not be able to descend below 7,000 feet until they are clear of the departure areas. Depending on the facility architecture, one controller may handle approaches to one runway. At other facilities, there may be several controllers feeding aircraft to the descent area, with one controller taking control for the approach sequencing. Depending on traffic and the number of satellite airports, there may be several controllers working traffic to specific satellite airports. Where there are fewer satellite airports or less traffic, one controller might be responsible for all satellite airport traffic. The ideal vectoring for approaches places aircraft on an extended downwind for the landing runway. By adjusting the length of the downwind leg, the controller can compensate for different aircraft speeds. This means that the slower aircraft will not have as long a downwind leg while the controller creates an opening on the final course. The controller is betting that the pilots will maintain speed and may have to request the lead aircraft to speed up and the following one to slow down. In some cases, the controller may have to vector the aircraft across the final approach course for spacing. The controller is supposed to inform the pilot that vectors will take the aircraft across the final approach course, as well as the reason for the vectors. If the controller is unable to inform the pilot, he is not expected to turn inbound until cleared for the approach. Vectoring to the final approach course has to be planned so that the aircraft intercepts the final approach course at least 2 miles outside the approach gate. The approach gate is a point used by ATC. Approach gates are on the final approach course 1 mile outside the outer marker or final approach fix. Approach gates must also be at least 5 miles from the runway threshold.
There are 2 conditions when the final approach course intercept can be made closer than 2 miles, but no closer than the approach gate. The first is if the ceiling is at least 500 feet above the minimum vectoring altitude and visibility is at least 3 miles. The second is if the pilot specifically requests to intercept the final approach course inside the approach gate.
There are also limits to the intercept angle. Less than 2 miles outside the approach gate, the maximum intercept angle is 20 degrees. 2 miles or more outside the approach gate, the limit is 30 degrees. Altitude at the intercept cannot be above the glide path, nor below the glide path intercept altitude specified on the approach chart. If deviations from the final course are observed outside the approach gate, the controller is supposed to provide vectors to intercept the final course. If deviations are detected inside the approach gate, the controller will inform the pilot and ask intentions. A high-density airport would also have a bright radar display in the control tower, which allows for monitoring of approach spacing. At the other extreme, there's an approach and landing at an airport which doesn't have a tower and is not in approach control airspace. The en route controller can provide radar vectors to the final approach course if the controller's display depicts the approach gate and a line showing the final approach course. There are other conditions, such as the range selected on the display or on an adjacent display. If the controller cannot provide vectors to the final approach course, the aircraft will be cleared to an initial approach fix and cleared for the approach. Spacing between IFR aircraft making approaches at a non-tower airport is considerably longer. The following aircraft cannot start the approach until the first aircraft has canceled the flight plan. Intervals are also longer when making an approach at an airport without an approach control, especially if the missed approach procedure calls for a return to the final approach fix. Delays at a non-tower airport located in a TRACON's airspace will be less likely because radar separation can be used while the aircraft are vectored to the final approach fix. It still holds that the following aircraft cannot start the approach until the first aircraft has canceled IFR. Aircraft operating in a non-radar approach control are subject to much the same delays because non-radar separation must be used.
There are overall operational standards for handling inbound aircraft. Each facility will have internal procedures which are established to best serve the airspace for which it's responsible.
In a moment, Dick Collins will give you some helpful hints on working within the ATC system. Now, here's Najib Halaby with his personal perspectives on the FAA's role in planning for the future of the air traffic control system.
The military control of airspaces has got to be diminished. They don't need this billions of cubic miles out there that are now restricted and constrain traffic through lots of coastal areas particularly. Second, they release that technology. They ought to release the work on data link, which I think they largely have. They ought to release the coding and the restrictions on GPS. Let's get our priorities right in aviation. Civil aviation is very, very important, and we should release the technology and the restrictions that were imposed by the Cold War. If I call in the moment before a Concorde coming in from Paris calls in, I sense the controller is going to give him an earlier turn in onto final, and I don't resent that. I launched the reliever airport program. When I came in as FAA administrator, there was no federal aid to airports, and I felt that was an essential part of the evolution, of the growth of the system. So we put aside each year, and they still do it today, a certain amount of money for reliever airports. Well, Leesburg and Manassas are reliever airports for Washington National, and now that Dulles is getting so popular and congested, for Dulles. So if I want to base at Dulles rather than Leesburg, I ought to face some restrictions and preferences. And I'm prepared to accept those. They're not very odious, and you ought to time your flights if you can a little bit in relation to the airline schedules.
If you fly a lot, either IFR or VFR getting traffic advisories, you spend a lot of time talking to air traffic controllers. In fact, if you have kids, you might even spend more time talking to air traffic controllers than you spend talking to your kids. The big difference is that aviation has a small vocabulary. So small that with English as the international language of aviation, foreign airline pilots can operate with what is branded as a 200-word English vocabulary. There's something to learn here about good communications. It is a standardized business. It has to be, because we're not always listening in the best of conditions, and understanding is critical to flight safety. For this reason, CB jargon is definitely out. Following the prescribed pronunciations, as in niner for nine, for example, is the way to go. Cutting corners is out. Following the book is in. For example, 14 can be confusing. 1/4000 is clear. Confusion is definitely out. If an instruction or clearance is not absolutely clear, get it verified. If unsure about an altitude assignment or a vector heading, ask. The air traffic controller has to be able to assume that you receive and understand his instructions, because that is the basis used to separate airplanes. That's why pilots read back clearances and instructions and say the altitude passing as well as the assigned altitude when checking in with a new controller. When calling a controller, always put the call sign of the aircraft before the message so the controller will know from the beginning which airplane is calling. As in, Cleveland Center, Mooney 186 Golf Mike is requesting lower. That way, the controller knows from the start which pilot wants to descend. Because time on any frequency is a finite resource, brevity is important. That doesn't mean you should be too brief, as in acknowledging an instruction or a clearance with a fast Roger. Just know what you're going to say in advance and then get it said. Frequencies are not to be used for other business, but occasionally, when times are slack, pilots will do so. When asking about something like the score of a ball game, remember the words used are outside the vocabulary and are not likely to be understood the first time.
I was flying along one day, the playoffs were on, and it took the controller 3 times to understand that what a pilot wanted was not a higher or lower altitude or a deviation. What he wanted was the score of the Redskins game.
We were talking about emergencies a while ago. This is a specific place where we get away from the usual words about altitudes, headings, airways, and frequencies. It is a critical place to use communication skills well so the controller will know what is wrong and what you want. Say, for example, this pilot just discovered smoke in the cockpit. He has 2 things to do. 1, run the smoke in cockpit part of the emergency checklist. And 2, start the wheels moving to get the smoking puppy on the ground. While looking at the list and starting there, the pilot might also key the mic and say, November 19 November, declaring an emergency. Request vectors to the nearest airport. The controller would likely understand all that and shoot back with an airport, a heading, and a lower altitude. Then he would probably inquire about the nature of the emergency, but good communicating on part of the pilot got the solutions underway first. Having a long discussion about smoke before establishing that something has to be done now would not be as efficient. A good way to improve communication skills is by listening. Airline pilots are generally good communicators, and there are a lot of them on the frequency. Pull up a chair in front of the fireplace, get a cool or warm drink, and listen in for a while. One thing you will notice is that while most pilots talk in a conversational tone, some shout at the mic. These pilots are in a high-noise environment and are not using a noise-attenuating headset. Even though it doesn't have to be done, the tendency is to try to shout over any noise you hear. If you don't hear the noise, you don't shout. One new factor that has come into play in recent years is the airline hub and spoke system, and what is referred to as airline pushes. This simply refers to the surge in traffic as all the American Airlines airplanes, for example, meet at Raleigh-Durham to swap passengers. What the push means is that the controller's workload ebbs and flows, as does the population of airplanes on their arrival and departure routes. It's tough to get an idea of pushes from studying the airline guide, though it can be done. The best deal is to learn them from experience and to file the preferred routes when bypassing hubs. Otherwise, you'll probably get a lot of vectors to steer you clear of all the arrival and departure routes and gates. There are times en route where you might want to ask for some change in routing or altitude or destination. A little homework done in advance will make this easier. If you're asking for direct to an airport outside the center's area in which you're flying, look up the lat long in advance. The controller will probably need it. Try, if you will, to request changes in a time that, from the level of activity on the frequency, appear not to be busy. Almost any change a controller approves involves some work on his part. If the scope is full, there simply may be no time to do this work. If you fly a slant R and want long direct legs, by all means file them on the flight plan. The happiest world of all for pilots and controllers alike comes when pilots file the route they really want to fly and controllers are able to clear them as filed. The most common request is for a change in altitude. Depending on other traffic, this may be approved right away, and it may not. It's best to ask for this as far in advance as possible. Remember, even if you're up to your eyeballs in ice, for example, the controller can't give you an altitude inhabited by other traffic. So, request that change in altitude before the ice becomes an emergency. When flying, you can tell when the controller is a happy person. It shows in his voice. If pilots smile when they talk, it comes across too. So remember to smile when you talk. There are some things that we as pilots do that don't work well in the system. We might as well air the dirty linen here. What is it that we do that perplexes or makes unhappy the person on the ground? One thing that can't help but bewilder and scare a controller is a pilot who sounds like he might have some problem but has no plan. Pilots have been known to call and say they need either a higher or a lower altitude. What's a controller to do with that? When you want to change, be specific. If you want a different altitude, pick one in advance, then call. If you want to fly a heading for weather, pick one and ask for it. As pilot in command, remain in command. If the time comes when you have a disagreement with a controller, don't take it up on the frequency. The phone numbers of all FAA facilities are in AOPA's Aviation USA or in the phone book. If you feel you have a complaint, write down the time, the facility, and the frequency, and then call on the phone after you land. If you're flying VFR and want traffic advisories, call and state your number and the fact that you want VFR advisories. If the controller has time, then you can discuss position and altitude and stuff like that. As a VFR introduction, don't make a long-winded speech. Finally, don't fly with a chip on your shoulder. The air traffic control system in this country is the best in the world, and it serves large and small airplanes equally well. Understand that it has to have procedures, and that the procedures have to be followed. Nothing fouls the system up more than a pilot who approaches the system as an adversary. It just doesn't work.
One day a controller called and told a pilot to turn right 30 degrees. The pilot shot back in an aggravated tone of voice and asked why the turn was necessary. The controller said it was for noise abatement. And the pilot said, noise abatement? The controller said, yes, it would make a lot of noise if you collided with that 727 I turned you away from. Just always understand that when the people on the ground ask you to do something, there's a good reason for it. Understand that, and you'll get where you're going as soon as possible and in the best state of mind possible. Next, we're going to tell you about some of the things that are coming to make the air traffic control system even better.
As you can see, the air traffic control system has become large and complex in order to handle the needs of the system, but it won't stop here.
The FAA is studying and implementing a number of new programs to augment the system's safety and efficiency. One of the most comprehensive plans to date is the Aviation System Capital Investment Plan. This plan is updated each December and is structured to be a living document. It is broken down into 6 chapters that include an introduction, the original National Airspace Plan, growth, infrastructure replenishment, supportability, and new capabilities. Still on the agenda of the Aviation System Capital Investment Plan is the implementation of controller suites, giving each controller direct computer access to a wide range of information and eliminating the use of paper flight strips. Each suite features multicolor, touch-sensitive displays. The goal of these suites is to give a uniformity to each controller station and to automate organizational tasks now performed by the controller.
Also pending is the implementation of automated control facilities, high-tech and consolidated centers and approach controls. Another project in the works is the Automated En route Air Traffic Control, or AERA, a refinement of the Apollo Traffic Management System. AERA will estimate flight progress to pinpoint not only future sector overloads, but also specific conflicts between aircraft. The computer will then automatically offer detailed resolutions for the conflict. The goal of AERA is to automatically give all aircraft a full flight free of conflict. The first phase of this, the Center TRACON's Automation System, or CTAS, is already being tested at some locations. The FAA is also looking at ways to improve communications. Data link, which gives control instructions by computer instead of voice, is already being used by some air carriers.
Special units mounted in the aircraft receive the information and enable the pilot to acknowledge receipt of data solely by computer. This data link will run through the Mode S system.
Mode S, which stands for Selective Address, is a transponder system where each aircraft is assigned a permanent code. This eliminates the tasks of assigning squawk codes and entering N numbers into the computer.
Mode S will eventually allow for automation of clearance and weather data delivery, since it can selectively address the recipient of such information. These are just a few of the projects currently underway. The air traffic control system is rapidly changing to reflect the growth in technology and air traffic. Although it is immense and complicated, each improvement on the system makes the work easier for those involved.
In the last couple of hours, we've taken you where unfortunately few pilots ever visit, behind the scenes of ATC. Understanding how the system works can help us as pilots to use it to our advantage and to help the system itself run more efficiently. Watching this video is only the first step in finding out everything you should know.
Now we hope you'll take the next step and visit one of the friendly ATC facilities near you. Visit with some of the fine folks you talk with on the radio and see what the mix of traffic looks like to them.
Many facilities offer a guided tour that the FAA calls Operation Rain Check. Some Operation Rain Check programs even offer the opportunity to grab a headset and plug in with a controller.
Visiting with a controller, listening in, and watching him work is an experience you'll not soon forget. And it'll help you appreciate the importance of the concise communications that we've been talking about on this tape. With that, I'll say goodbye, remind you to always talk with a smile in your voice, and then we'll see you on the next Sporties video. I'm Dick Collins.
And I'm Rob Ryder, for all of us at Sporties. So long.
As a pilot, you'll carry